The exemplars of freedom from the Eastern European bloc continue to fight with everything to reshape the world order in accordance with international security systems. The differing aims of both sides cause the effects of the war to spill over into much larger areas than Ukrainian territory. The Baltic countries' efforts to prevent the passage of Russian Navy ships invoke the 4th Article of NATO and the 9th Article of Montreux, trapping and intimidating Vladimir Putin in this invasion. Putin does not receive the necessary and critical naval support for his plans in Ukraine, and his trusted allies, such as Belarusians and Chechens, are fighting for freedom within the Ukrainian ranks against the Russians. Instead of supporting him in the name of reviving the old Soviet Russia and Stalin's empire of fear, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin administration, and the Russian armed forces, including senior Russian generals and commanders, all drag the world into complete chaos. The military and financial support of the Ukrainian army in the most critical war of the century by the USA and Western Europe leaves the Russian leader completely helpless on Ukrainian soil. All these efforts bring to the fore the unsung heroes who took action for the independence war of Kiev, as well as the Ukrainian army. Yes, this military force is none other than the free Chechen warriors who sweat on the front lines and even risk their lives for Ukraine. Of course, the struggle of the Chechen soldiers fighting for the Ukrainian army is of critical importance. When we look at the current situation on the front lines in Ukraine, we can understand this importance much more clearly. Chechen fighters currently serve as the supporting military force of the Ukrainian forces, concentrating in Bakhmut, which is considered the bastion of the war. Bakhmut was an eastern Ukrainian city of about 70,000 inhabitants known for its salt mines and sparkling wine. Today, Bakhmut is known as the site of months of brutal war, with less than 10,000 people left. But the footprints of the unsung heroes have not been erased from Bakhmut. To prevent the city from falling into Russian hands, the so-called unsung heroes, the killing machines in the Ukrainian army, the Chechen fighters, are currently carrying out a full-scale chasing operation in Bakhmut. Ukraine's Chechen military units continue to chase the Russians, even in the deepest parts of the city, using DIY multiple rocket launchers on the Bakhmut front lines. Images of these striking systems were recently shown by the soldiers of the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, which is a part of the 28th Mechanized Brigade. However, Chechen soldiers are involved in the use of these weapons. Published photos show the launch of the S-8 80mm aviation unguided rockets, and the systems for these rockets are mounted in the back of a light SUV and ready for use. One such DIY rocket launcher can launch 18 unguided aircraft rockets. Control is carried out through a special remote control panel, and the ignition process itself is automated as much as possible. The aircraft has 80mm caliber unguided rockets and is designed to destroy enemy equipment and manpower from the air. Here, Chechen warriors who have even mastered such war machines are inflicting hell on the Russians in Bakhmut. The chasing operation of the Sheikh Mansour Battalion against the invading forces in Bakhmut continues to follow the invaders to their lairs in this city. A dozen Russian soldiers were reportedly killed as a result of this stunning chase operation. It is also claimed that, in addition to the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, 5 Chechen volunteer battalions fighting for the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut are still performing critical missions. Some soldiers from these 5 Chechen volunteer battalions, as well as the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, even took part in the recent chase operation they organized against the Russians. Currently, the Russians who have fled to wooded areas and cave-type rocks in Bakhmut cannot even respond to the fierce attacks of the Sheikh Mansour Battalion and other Chechen soldiers. They prefer these wooded areas and cliffs to track down some Russian soldiers who barely escaped in Bakhmut. But the Chechen warriors seem intent on continuing this dramatic chase operation and driving the Russians out of their hiding places. For this purpose, it has been reported that the Sheikh Mansour Battalion is still using DIY rocket launchers to force the Russians out of their hiding spaces, almost continuing the missile showers. On the other hand, the Sheikh Mansour Battalion has been fighting against the Russian invaders since 2014. The initiator of the establishment of the Tabor, named after Sheikh Mansour, was the Free Caucasus social and political movement created in 2006. This movement made significant contributions to Kiev in the war in Ukraine. Besides Bakhmut, this battalion has served in most of the front lines of Donbass and declares that they will not leave until Bakhmut, which is now the stronghold of the war, is taken back. So why is Bakhmut so important? And why are the Ukrainian army and the Chechen soldiers fighting for Kiev so focused on it? For the past 5 months, clashes around Bakhmut, a small city in eastern Ukraine, have been reminiscent of scenes from the First World War, with soldiers fighting in old-style trenches and launching often deadly attacks across open terrain. Bakhmut serves as a battlefield for half the army's strength of both sides of the war. And as the general war continues, Bakhmut becomes not only a particularly fierce battleground but also the most important contest of the war. Bakhmut's importance has grown since November, when Ukraine recaptured the southern city of Kherson and the onset of winter slowed the pace of war elsewhere. This week, Russia claimed to have captured the town of Soledar and even a smaller city less than 16 kilometers outside of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian government claims that its troops are still currently resisting, but President Vladimir Zelensky admits that the situation in the city is difficult. So, what does Russia want to gain there? Strategically, analysts and officials on both sides agree that Bakhmut has limited strategic value. If it falls, it probably won't significantly improve Russian President Vladimir Putin's chances of achieving his war goals, and holding Bakhmut won't change the game for Ukraine. All this raises the question of why so many people's lives are spent fighting for this small city. However, if we look at the city from another perspective, Bakhmut creates a military logistics bridge for the fronts on both the Donetsk and Luhansk front lines, functioning as a home base from which both Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian leader Zelensky control the war. In fact, the present Bakhmut war began after Russia captured the nearby cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, gains that came during the Russian military's summer offensive to take Donetsk, one of the Ukrainian territories Moscow now officially claims as Russian territory. In the first phase of the clashes, the Battle of Bakhmut was mainly fought by the Russian army. But over the past few months, the city has mostly been used by the Wagner Group, recruited from Russian prisons. This group fought in generally poorly organized waves and suffered heavy losses in Bakhmut. The exact number of casualties on both sides is unknown. U.S. officials estimated last week that 4,100 of Wagner's 50,000 mercenary force were killed, and 10,000 were wounded. Most of the losses of the pro-Russian mercenary group occurred in clashes around Bakhmut. A senior Ukrainian military official claimed that between 100 and 300 Russian soldiers were killed every day in the Battle of Bakhmut. Ukrainian casualties in Bakhmut were also high, according to the UK's Defense Ministry. Ukraine has deployed substantial military reinforcements to Bakhmut in the past 2 weeks after suffering heavy casualties. Despite these efforts and the Ukrainian army taking control of most of Bakhmut, the Russians have not given up conducting offensive operations in the city. Therefore, the fire of the war in the city is not extinguished yet. The Ukrainian armed forces achieved significant success in local counterattacks northwest of Bakhmut. This victory, which came with the withdrawal of Russian troops on the southern coast of the Berkhovsky region, was a turning point that turned the course of the war in favor of the Ukrainian army. Images shared by a number of Russian mil bloggers visually confirmed claims that Ukrainian forces are making gains in the area northwest of Bakhmut between Bohdonivka and Verkhovka. According to Russian military bloggers, elements of the 200th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian 14th Corps lost their positions in the area between Heroica and Dubova-Vasilivka, about 6 kilometers northwest of Bakhmut. In addition, Ukrainian troops counterattacked Kromov, Borovitska, and Kryshika Wagner. Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is active in the region, reported that Ukrainian forces approached Shevka and that the Ukrainian army strengthened its positions 500 meters from the northwestern city limits of Bakhmut. However, the Russian Ministry of Defense rejected the claims of other Russian sources regarding the Ukrainian advance and instead claimed that elements of the 4th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 200th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade repelled all attacks in the Markivka area. Although the Russian defense minister denied this news, Prigozhin's rhetoric confirmed that the Ukrainian army had made a significant gain in Bakhmut and denied the Russian defense ministry. After successful offensive operations by the Ukrainian army this week, the Russian military allegedly carried out explosive provocations to justify their temporary flight from Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory and the announcements of evacuation. So, is the Russian army close to defeat at Bakhmut? Recently, the news from Bakhmut is not very encouraging for the Russian army, according to Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin, boss of the pro-Kremlin mercenary group Wagner. Russian troops fled to the flanks around Bakhmut. Commander Prigozhin claimed that the Russian Ministry of Defense lied a bit after claiming that a Ukrainian offensive had been repelled near Bakhmut before Moscow troops regrouped at a new position with favorable conditions. Russian forces control most of Bakhmut, but Ukrainian troops still hold out in the western parts of Donbass city and have launched counterattacks from the flanks. Despite its limited strategic value, Bakhmut has developed enormous symbolic significance for both sides and has become a potential target for a long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive. Recently, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that an attack by Ukraine in the vicinity of Soledar, directly north of Bakhmut, was repelled on the tactical front. Soledar. Ukrainian troops carried out offensive actions of more than 95 kilometers along the entire battle line. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement, "Units of the armed forces of Ukraine carried out 26 attacks, which included more than 1,000 soldiers, up to 40 tanks, other military and special equipment. All attacks of units of the armed forces of Ukraine were repelled. No progress was made. Russian troops were allowed to defend on the Mariinivka front in order to increase the stability of the defense. The troops of the southern group of Russian troops took control of the border." Taking into account the favorable conditions of the Verkhovka Reservoir, however, Commander Prigozhin strongly objected to this version of events, claiming that the gains of Ukraine could lead to the gradual encirclement of Bakhmut, claiming that Russia's months-long advance has been reversed. Commander Prigozhin said the entire operation from the west to Bakhmut has been going on for 7 months. "During this time we took the Bear Creek Reservoir, specifically the settlements of Markivka, and proceeded along the Bakhmut-Sloviansk road in the direction of Sloviansk. Now the opposite is happening. After transferring the wings, there was no tactical retreat. The Russian Defense Ministry lied a little, to put it mildly. The Russian troops just fled from the flanks," he said. Commander Prigozhin has been increasingly outspoken in his criticisms of top Russian military figures, including Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. Earlier this month, Commander Prigozhin said Wagner would be withdrawn from Bakhmut and blamed the Ministry of Defense for this, but later reversed that stance after more supplies were promised. Last week, Commander Prigozhin, nicknamed Putin's chief, insisted that Bakhmut would be taken. The Ukrainian defenders also praised and commented that the enemy is well-equipped, well-trained, coordinated, and resists with dignity. "So we continue on our way. Everything shines. It burns." Russia resorts to all kinds of black propaganda to cover up the losses of the Ukrainian war. One of the most obvious examples of this came from Prigozhin again recently, according to Ukrainian officials. Wagner Group is bragging about the death of a U.S. citizen in Bakhmut who volunteered to fight for Ukraine. In a video posted to social media by Wagner over the weekend, Wagner Group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin appears to be standing over the corpse of former U.S. Army Green Beret Nicholas Mamer as he examines documents. Officials said Mama's uncle Paul Mamer and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Perry Blackburn, who helped enlist in Boise, Idaho, 45, who was native to fight in Ukraine last year, unfortunately confirmed the identity of the body in the video. Ukrainian officials said the video was proof that Wagner incited violence using widely shared graphic video footage. Commander Prigozhin's video highlights that Wagner constantly promotes brutality and glorifies war because the video shows Wagner bragging about the death of a U.S. citizen. Mamer was reportedly killed when a Russian artillery shell hit a building where he was stationed in Bakhmut for most of the war. Mima's uncle Paul Mamer was, I understand, giving them first-hand training in that area so they could continue the war. And he was behind enemy lines. "It's so cruel that Nick died there," he said. Paul Mamer also stated that his nephew died at the age of 45 and had a good life, joined the struggle in Ukraine for humanitarian reasons, and hoped that a veteran's funeral would be held for his nephew. His family is trying to get Mamer to the U.S. just for a proper burial. His family thinks Mamer deserves to be buried at the Veterans Cemetery. Mamer did not fight for the United States, but because he believed in the freedom of Ukraine, he was fighting to defend his own truth. So what does the U.S. think about this issue? The U.S. Department of State has not officially confirmed Mamer's death. However, a U.S. official said the ministry is seeking additional information and is aware of reports of the death of a U.S. citizen in Bakhmut. It was also revealed by the Ukrainian authorities that a few weeks after Mamer arrived in Ukraine, He told the officials of his unit that he was preparing a training program for the Ukrainian military that he hoped would help save some lives. Subsequently, the U.S. Department warned U.S. citizens not to travel to Ukraine because of the war, and urged the remaining U.S. citizens to leave Ukraine immediately if it was safe to do so using any other commercial or privately available ground transportation options. Prigozhin is making a video proudly of this and making the death of the U.S. soldier. A propaganda material can of course be considered as a method used to cover up the bad course of the Bakhmut war on behalf of Russia. But this is not enough to hide the fact that the war is progressing against Russia.